Laura, you brought up sort of suburban schools, middle-class schools, and we had this conversation about in order to solidify political support for our movement, for the school choice movement, you want it to go across the board. We talk a lot about the achievement gap and focusing on the biggest issues that we've got in the country. And in my heart, the thing that gets us all out of bed in the morning is the achievement gap and the opportunity for low-income kids to have access. What about these networks that are coming on? And we have strong ones in Arizona. They are in suburban districts. They are extremely high-performing. So they're for wealthy families, regardless of race. But by and large, these are for wealthier families, and they are way fast in terms of achievement. They're way up high, way beyond the best suburban districts. Now, my take on this is I'm watching it politically, and it's having a huge effect in terms of support for the movement. But there's also a lot of concern that that's going to take air out of the room, right? And you're going to get a pitting of our attention to those schools versus others. So any thoughts about that?
Well, I think the first thing you have to think about too is that just suburban is changing as well. I was watching the news last night. We're in the middle of a presidential election, right?
Really?
And so I was listening to a report from Iowa. Now I'm from California where, it's like we're already, nobody pays attention to us anymore, except for the ATM machine for the presidential candidates. But they were talking about Iowa, and they were talking about the potential of the swing vote and the Latino swing vote. This is Iowa. This isn't Los Angeles or Texas or Arizona. This is Iowa. So I was listening to it intently. I think across the country, demographics are changing. And so as we look at it, suburban, what's suburban today might be considered urban or just sort of an extension of it. That's certainly true in California. But I think to the larger question of does it take away, I think our focus is overall, we want to have, and I think we should never lose sight of closing the achievement gap, of looking at the most needy of students, sort of the biggest gaps in education. And I would still submit to you that the biggest gaps, the most obvious points of failure are when we take a look at the paucity of educational opportunities and the quality of those opportunities that are still offered to English language learner kids or high poverty, black, brown, and I'm going to put in special education, which correlates heavily with African American male youth in particular and Latino youth. So I still think that, the the beauty of our movement is still to kind of think about the roots and the foundation, but it does not mean that we shy away from or that we do not provide for middle class, more affluent white youth, because parental choice is parental choice. And I do believe in that. And I think, too, as we look at our nation and where we stand in the world, we're looking at a global competitive economy. So we want quality education for all. We don't necessarily want to say this is only about poor kid or black and brown kids. But I think that when we have opportunities and when we look at the need of where the greatest needs are, I think we would be remiss if we didn't say that much of even our original foundations, the same pressure points are still here today. So there is great work and attention that's needed still from where we started.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think the easiest way for us to fail as a movement is to work with the hypocrisy that says only certain kids deserve freedom or only certain kids and certain parents want something different. I just think that's a huge mistake. Now, I'm not going to choose to work on that because, I don't think, I'm not spending my time on middle class and upper income Americans. That's not something that I want to do. But there are people who do. And at the end of the day, I think our movement should be expansive enough that, we can provide, quality for people across the board and across the continuum if, in fact, they adhere to the same principles of charter schools. Charter schools have certain principles, and if you put it in a rich community or a poor community, the principles should be the same.
Yeah. The interesting sort of large-scale statistic over the past 20 years, district or enrollment in K-12 has grown about 19%. During that same period, district enrollment, assigned school enrollment, has grown only 11%. Yeah. And most of that shift has come in the last 5 years. And what you're getting in states like Arizona is a 2% decrease in the districts every year and about a 30% increase on the choice side every year. So those of you who are really Jiffy Swift at math could plot that out, right? We're coming to a point where the politics get really tight on this. So speaking of, talk a little bit about the politics of this now. So in communities of color, I mean, since I was just marginally aware that we were in the middle of an election season, Gloria, I was fascinated to hear this morning again on the news how women are voting. Seriously? Like women just get up and vote one way? I mean, really, they're like the women's vote. And my daughter just wrote something that said that in the last debate, the president used the word woman 7 times. Romney only used it once, and my daughter wrote, and he managed not to talk about binders in the same sentence, which was really good. So, it's not as though, you know, the Latino community, the African American community were of a mind here, right, on school reform. So how you confront this issue in the community itself, you got the same goal, closing the achievement gap, and wildly divergent opinions about whether what you're doing, you with Parent Trigger and all those things, I mean, at a very personal level, and you can with Bayo, you guys are certainly up against it in the community. So how does that play out? I mean, how do you, what does that look like in the next 5 years?
Yeah. I mean, I think it plays out the way that it's always played out, and that is basically that, you know, power never concedes power without a fight. And so when we take a look at California, and I'll go to California overall, we find that some of the biggest forces against charter schools and new authorization and the criticisms that we're going to back to Plessy rather than moving forward are teachers' unions, for example. And for purposes of full disclosure, I'm a member of teachers union. I still pay my union dues, and I'm affiliated with the #1 political force in California, the California Teachers Association, but I'll always confront them. So I think that we find these issues of trying to figure out political strategies. I think where it gets really interesting, and we're seeing this in Los Angeles as well as we speak, I think we have a reform superintendent in LA Unified, Superintendent John Daisy, and he's trying to basically turn around. Whether it's reconstitute, we'll see how it shapes out, 2 schools, Crenshaw and Dorsey, which are in historically predominant African American communities. So you take that issue, right away you start looking at, sort of from the adult perspective, the interest of putting adults first rather than students, you right away start finding the question about, well, wait a minute, these are our jobs. And then you get to the teacher force, and especially the classified, which are more women and people of color. Yeah. So suddenly then you, and are more actively involved in the community, in the churches, in the commerce that takes place, or in the communities around Dorsey and Crenshaw, because LA is a very segregated town, make no doubt about it. And zip code will tell us more about our lives than we care to admit. So you look at these, and I think for us in the charter school movement that's very interested in looking at quality in education, getting our kids from not dropping out and not going to prison and graduating and going forward, I think the challenge is sometimes how do you ally and work with unions, but also never having the temerity and never having the fear to question and challenge the leadership that appears too often to be looking out for the jobs of the adults, which are needed, but saying, you know, these members don't work just because they enjoy going to work. They're looking out for opportunities in the future of their children. So it is a complex path that we have to navigate, but I think we can't be afraid to just jump in and sometimes get, you know, the arrows thrown at us, and believe me, I've had lots of arrows thrown at me.
Yeah. And I do think that a lot of the argument is economic, right? That they don't come out and say that this is about economics, but for a lot of people it is. The black middle class in this country is built on the school system, you know, without a doubt. So when you start talking about going in, changing that, people are saying, you know what, I love kids, but you know, now you're talking about my livelihood. And so I think we have to do a better job of one, creating opportunities, helping folks understand that if you're a good educator, quality educator, I don't care what system we set up, they're going to be working and employed, and in fact, sometimes have greater opportunities. But we have to have those conversations, and we have to help people, you know, realize that. And then in particular, I think something that's unique for the black community is this romantic notion of the school system, right, that came out of Brown and the fight. You know, it's hard to get past that. You know, it's hard, you know, every time you have this conversation, they'll say, I know, but I just want the system to get better. You know, and you have that conversation in community and community and state after state after state. And it takes a while before, you know, people finally realize, yeah, I keep trying to fix this thing, but it's not getting fixed. So, but that's there, and it's big, and it's a bit of, you know, psychological, you know, hang up, and it's not easy to get past, but it's there.
And I think listening to what even like Howard Fuller had said, this isn't about fixing the system.
Right.
This is about a revolution.
Right.
I mean, to me, I think that, and we shouldn't be afraid of that word. I look at it, and I think that, to me, the power of the civil rights movement is, yeah, it was, we walked through, it's not a time portal. This is as living today as it was in, you know, April of 1968. This is real. I mean, and again, too, what better way to bring us back to reality than to listen and to see for ourselves, not just the image in the photograph, that iconic photograph of the pointed finger, but to have the opportunity to, I mean, I'm going to say just touch Reverend Kyle's. I sat there and I thought, I'm standing next to him. But I think to us, as we go home after today, we get on those buses and we leave this portal in time and we go back to our homes. I think it's understanding that we have got the challenge to take this legacy, this movement, this time, and to translate it for our own communities and just build it forward.
So I want to hit on one thing just really briefly, and then we're going to take some questions. And you talked about Plessy versus Brown, right? Are we moving, which direction are we moving in? And I'm fascinated by the conversation and the terminology of the term segregation in education. And as a linguistics major, I think words matter enormously. And it's very important to me to make this very clear. There is no segregation that is an active act on the part of the person we're talking about. Segregation is done to you. It is done in assignment. It is done with no interest in your will, right? And when people talk about what a school looks like now and that school choice oftentimes is operating in affinity communities, right? You do end up with schools that are largely Latino. Why? Because it was started by the Hispanic Community Forum in a Latino neighborhood, and parents are choosing to attend that school. Is that the same thing as segregation? It is not. On the other hand, if we come out down the road and we are finding ourselves separate, that is its own consequence. And so I don't know how we struggle with that, other than I think the definitions are extremely important, and we ought not allow people to lay claim to the word segregation when communities of affinity by choice align themselves with each other. That is not an act of segregation. That's an act of will, and it has a result. So maybe you guys can talk about that a little bit, because it's real right now for so many people.
Yeah. Yeah. That's always a hard conversation for me to have, and you know, there are a lot of people who just don't agree with my views. So, but I'll share Ken Campbell's little view of the world.
That's a good thing.
So the first
That's why
thing
Ken
is
Campbell's here.
The first thing is I always, without a doubt, reject the notion that a school that's all black or all brown is by definition going to be a failing school, right? You can have schools of excellence that are all black or all Latino. And so that's the first thing for me. When people start talking about segregation, it's as if you set up this school and it's all black kids, it can't be successful. And so I completely reject, you know, that part of the notion. The second thing that I struggle with often is, you know, our experience in working with parents in different communities is I'm not sure how much our families are driven by diversity of school. You know, I think it's somewhere down the line, but I don't think it's at the top, you know, of their, you know, they don't say, well, I want my child to go to a diverse school, right? Mm-hmm. They say, I want my child to go to a good school, I want them to go to a safe school. You know, you have all these things, and then if all that kind of works and it could be diverse, that's great, right? But we got so much work to do on all these other things that I don't know how we get here. You know, we spend a lot of time, or some people do, and energy on that piece. Yeah. But I think right now our most urgent need is to create good, safe schools, quality schools for kids, regardless of where they're located.
Yeah. In Spanish, we basically say cuando le conviene, which basically is, you know, when it's convenient. And I think, you know, if we look at California, I'm sure it's not too different from the other 49 states. The reality is our public education school system today, and has been for quite some time segregated. The question is, I think, what are we trying to do to produce outcomes that work? Again, to equality, equity, adequacy, taking a look at closing that achievement gap. And I agree with you in that sense, where if we think about affirmative action, if we think about ethnic studies, for example, I mean, I support and applaud these programs to go forward so that we can focus on youth who need intervention, whether it comes from resources or closing that teaching gap as well too, redistribution of resources within a school system, looking even at this study that's coming out about teacher salary and the inequity.
Absolutely.
And we know what that means. Just by looking at that, you know where the money's going, and it's not going to. So the ultimate assignment, the ultimate segregation, I would say, honestly, is zip code.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, I don't think we need to fear that. You're right, though. I don't think we can get sort of like baited into this game, because when it's convenient now to say, because we're developing schools in which obviously, my daughter would say, duh, you know, African American and Latino parents are saying, I want a school system that works for me, so I'm willing to get on that bus. I'm willing to get on that car and find a charter school or a school that is willing to understand my child needs, deserves, merits, and is capable of learning. And we can bypass those that soft bigotry of low expectations that our parents know exists. So that's not segregation. That's a new, you know, underground railroad system, and we're going to run through it.
But like Gloria said, though, we can't lose sight of the fact that, you know, you gotta press for equity. Right, so we have to continue to stay on the side. I mean, it's okay that we're going to set up these schools where the kids are, right, and all the kids may look the same, but we certainly have to continue to focus on equity, right? That they have the same resources, that they have the same shot, you know, as everybody else. And there are a lot of ways that's you know, that can be hidden in the work. So we definitely have to pay attention to that.
It's huge, and we don't even have time to get into that, but before I go rocking on a porch somewhere, we are going to deal with this equity question where school finance ought to be about needs of students and not zip codes and not where you happen to be lucky enough to live. So that's its own thing.